Hey guys, good morning. It's Mr. Palma here. So, to start things out, we are going to look at Chapter 7 of the narrative of the life and the death of Frederick Douglass. Now, it's been a while, so I'm just going to do a quick recap. Frederick Douglass was a slave at this other place, and he had a really bad slave owner. And it was speculated that that slave owner was his father. And so he was treated worse than any of the other slaves because he was half African American and half white. And so then he got transferred to another plantation, and this one was different because they had never owned a slave before. So they treated him a lot kinder, at least they did in the beginning. And the mistress of the house even taught him how to read, and that was a big deal. And the owner said to her, don't teach a slave to read and write because it will help them start thinking for themselves. And that's a pivotal point in Frederick Douglass' life. So that's just the recap, and now I'll go through the chapter questions with you guys. So sit back, get comfortable, get your coffee or tea, whatever, and let's begin. So chapter 7. How did Mrs. Ould change, and why did she change? What plan did Frederick adopt to learn how to read now that Mrs. Ould was no longer teaching him? Why is it ironic that he bribed the little white boys to teach him to read? Spoiler alert, but these are good questions to be paying attention to while we're going through the chapter together. What irony does Frederick find in this statement? It is almost an unpardonable offense to teach slaves to read in this Christian country. What did Frederick learn from the book, The Columbian Orator? And how did Mr. Ould's prediction about Frederick and learning come true? How does Frederick learn the meaning of the word abolition and abolitionist? What do the two Irishmen encourage him to do? Why does he not trust them? Number 9. How does Frederick learn to write? How does he trick the white boys into teaching him new letters? So those are all the questions we're going to be thinking about while we're reading through the chapter. And I don't think I said it, so welcome to my living room. If you see my fat cats roaming around, that's fine. They won't interrupt the lesson. And I'll post a link down below if you do want to follow along with the book anyway, but it might just be easier if I read it. So, here we go. I lived in Master Hugh's family about 7 years. During this time, I succeeded in learning to read and write. In accomplishing this, I was compelled to resort to various stratagems. I had no regular teacher. My mistress, who had kindly commenced to instruct me, had, in compliance with the advice and direction of her husband, not only ceased to instruct me, but had set her face against my being instructed by anyone else. It is due, however, to my mistress to say of her that she did not adopt this course of treatment immediately. She at first lacked the depravity indispensable to shutting me up in mental darkness. It was at least necessary for her to have some training in the exercise of irresponsible power, to make her equal to the task of treating me as though I were a brute. My mistress was, as I have said, a kind and tender-hearted woman, and in the simplicity of her soul, she commenced, when I first went to live with her, to treat me as she supposed one human being ought to treat another. In entering upon the duties of a slaveholder, she did not seem to perceive that I sustained to her the relation of a mere chattel, and that for her to treat me as a human being was not only wrong, but dangerously so. Slavery proved as injurious to her as it did to me. When I went there, She was a pious, warm, and tender-hearted woman. There was no sorrow or suffering for which she had not a tear. She had bread for the hungry, clothes for the naked, and comfort for every mourner that came within her reach. Slavery soon proved its ability to divest her of these heavenly qualities. Under its influence, the tender heart became stone, and the lamb-like disposition gave way to one of tiger-like fierceness. The first step in her downward course was in her ceasing to instruct me. She now commenced to practice her husband's precepts. She finally became even more violent in her opposition than her husband himself. She was not satisfied with simply doing as well as he had commanded. She seemed anxious to do better. Nothing seemed to make her more angry than to see me with the newspaper. She seemed to think that here lay the danger. I have had her rush at me with a face made up of all fury, and snatch from me a newspaper, in a manner that fully revealed her apprehension. She was an apt woman, and a little experience soon demonstrated to her satisfaction that education and slavery were incompatible with each other. From this time I was most narrowly watched. If I was in a separate room any considerable length of time, I was sure to be suspected of having a book, and was at once called to give an account of myself. All this, however, was too late. The first step had been taken. Mistress, in teaching me the alphabet, had given me the inch, and no precaution could prevent me from taking the L. The plan which I adopted, and the one by which I was most successful, was that of making friends of all the little white boys whom I met in the street. As many of these as I could, I converted into teachers. With their kindly aid, obtained at different times and at different places, I finally succeeded in learning to read. When I was sent off errands, I always took my book with me, and by going one part of my errand quickly, I found time to get a lesson before my return. I used to also carry bread with me, enough of which was always in the house, and to which I was always welcome, for I was much better off in this regard than many of the poor white children in our neighborhood. The bread I used to bestow upon the hungry little urchins, who, in return, would give me that more valuable bread of knowledge. I am strongly tempted to give the names of 2 or 3 of those little boys, as testimonial of the gratitude and affection I bear them. But prudence forbids, not that it would injure me, but it might embarrass them, for it is almost an unpardonable offense in this Christian country to teach slaves to read. It is enough to say of the little dear fellows that they lived on Philpott Street, very near Durgin and Bailey's shipyard. I used to talk this matter of slavery over with them. I would sometimes say to them, I wished they could be as free as they would be when they got to be men. You will be free as soon as you are 21, but I am a slave for life. Have not I as good a right to be free as you have? These words used to trouble them. They would express for me the liveliest sympathy, and console me with the hope that something would occur by which I might be free. I was now about 12 years old, and the thought of being a slave for life began to bear heavily upon my heart. Just about this time, I got a hold of a book entitled The Columbian Orator. Every opportunity I had, I used to read this book. Among much of other interesting matter, I found in it a dialogue between a master and his slave. The slave was represented as having run away from his master 3 times. The dialogue represented the conversation which took place between them, when the slave was retaken the 3rd time. In this dialogue, the whole argument in behalf of slavery was brought forward by the master, all of which was disposed by the slave. The slave was made to say some very smart as well as impressive things in reply to his master, things which had the desired through unexpected effect, for the conversation resulted in the voluntary emancipation of the slave on behalf of the master. In the same book, I met with one of Sheridan's mighty speeches, and in behalf of Catholic emancipation. These were choice documents to me. I read them over and over again with unabated interest. They gave tongue to interesting thoughts of my own soul, which had frequently flashed through my mind, and died away to want an utterance. The moral which I gained from the dialogue was the power of truth over the conscience of even a slaveholder. What I got from Sheridan was a bold denunciation of slavery, and a powerful vindication of human rights. The reading of these documents enabled me to utter my thoughts and to meet the arguments brought forward to sustain slavery. But while they relieved me of one difficulty, they brought on an even more painful than the one of which I was relieved. The more I read, the more I was led to abhor and detest my enslavers. I could regard them in no other light than a band of successful robbers, who had left their homes, gone to Africa, and stolen us from our homes, and in a strange land reduced us to slavery. I loathed them as being the meanest, as well as the most wicked of men. As I read and contemplated the subject, behold, that very discontentment which Master Hugh had predicted would follow my learning to read had already come, to torment and sting my soul to utterable anguish. As I writhed under it, I would at times feel that learning to read had been a curse rather than a blessing. It had given me a view of my wretched condition, without the remedy. It opened my eyes to the horrible pit, but to no ladder upon which how to get out. In moment of agony, I envied my fellow slaves for their stupidity. I had often wished myself a beast. I preferred the condition of the meanest reptile to my own. Anything, no matter what, to get rid of thinking. It was this everlasting thinking of my condition that tormented me. There was no getting rid of it. It was pressed upon me by every object within sight or hearing, animate or inanimate. The silver trump of freedom had roused my soul to eternal wakefulness. Freedom now appeared, to disappear no more forever. It was heard in every sound, and seen in everything. It was ever present to torment me with a sense of my wretched condition. I saw nothing without seeing it. I heard nothing without hearing it, and felt nothing without feeling it. It looked from every star. It smiled in every calm, breathed in every wind, and moved in every storm. I often found myself regretting my own existence, and wishing myself dead, and but the hope of being free. I had no doubt that I should have killed myself, or done something for which I should have been killed. While in this state of mind, I was eager to hear at every one speak of slavery. I was a ready listener. Every little while I could hear something about the abolitionists. It was some time before I found what the word meant. It was always used in such connection as to make it an interesting word to me. If a slave ran away and succeeded in getting clear, or if a slave killed his master, set fire to a barn, or hid anything very wrong in the mind of a slaveholder, it was spoken of as the fruit of abolition. Hearing the word in this connection very often, I set apart learning what it meant. The dictionary afforded me little or no help, but I found that it was the act of abolitioning. But then I did not know what was to be abolitioned. Here I was perplexed. I did not dare ask anyone about its meaning. for I was satisfied that it was something they wanted me to know very little about. After a patient waiting, I got one of our city papers containing the account of the numbers of petitions from the North, praying for abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia and of the slave trade between the states. From this time I understood the word abolition and abolitionist, and always drew near when the word was spoken, expecting to hear something of importance to myself and fellow slaves. The light broke in upon me by degrees. I went one day down on the wharf of Mr. Waters, and seeing two Irishmen unloading a scow of stone, I went, unasked, and helped them. When I had finished, one of them came to me and asked if I were a slave. I told him I was. He asked, "Are ye a slave for life?" I told him I was. The good Irishman seemed to be deeply affected by the statement. He said to the other that it was a pity so fine a little fellow as myself should be a slave for life. He said that it was a shame to hold me. They both advised me to run away to the North, that I should find friends there, and that I should be fine. I pretended not to be interested in what they said, and treated them as if I did not understand them, for I feared they might be treacherous. White men have been known to encourage slaves to escape, and then, to get the reward, catch them and return them to their masters. I was afraid that these seemingly good men might use me so, but I nevertheless remembered their advice, and from that time I resolved to run away. I looked forward to a time at which it would be safe for me to escape. I was too young to think of doing so immediately. Besides, I wished to learn how to write, as I might have occasion to write my own pass. I consoled myself with the hope that I should one day find a good chance. Meanwhile, I would learn to write. The idea as how I might learn to write was suggested to me in Bergen, in Bailey's shipyard, and by frequently seeing the ship's carpenters, after hewing and getting a piece of timber ready for use, write on the timber the name of that part of the ship for which it was intended. When a piece of timber was intended for the larboard side, it would be marked thus, L. When a piece was for the starboard side, it would be marked thus, S. Starboard, by the way, means right, and port is left. A piece for the larboard side forward would be marked thus, LF. When a piece was for starboard side forward, it would be marked thus, SF. For larboard aft, it would be marked thus, LA. For starboard aft, it would be marked thus, SA. I soon learned the names of these letters, and for what they were intended when placed upon a piece of timber on the shipyard. I immediately commenced copying them. And in a short time was able to make the 4 letters named. After that, when I met with any boy who I knew could write, I would tell him I could write as well as he. The next words would be, "I don't believe you. Let me see you try it." I would then make the letters which I had been so fortunate as to learn, and asked him to beat that. In this way I got a good many lessons in writing, which is quite possible I should never have gotten in any other way. During this time my copybook was the board fence, brick wall, and pavement. My pen and ink was a lump of chalk. With these I learned mainly how to write. I then commenced and continued copying the italics in Webster's spelling book, until I could make them all without looking on the book. By the time my little Master Thomas had gone to school, and learned how to write, and had written over a number of copybooks, these had been brought home and shown to some of our near neighbors, and then laid aside. My mistress used to go to class meetings at the Wilk Street Meeting House every Monday afternoon, and leave me to take care of the house. When left thus, I used to spend time in writing in the spaces left in Master Thomas's copybook, copying what he had written. I continued to do this until I could write a hand very similar to that of Master Thomas. Thus, after a long, tedious effort for years, I finally succeeded in learning how to write. Well, according to my thing, this is the end of the chapter. What a chapter. Okay, so now if you remember, I asked some questions in the beginning of the chapter that we were going to think about while I was reading to you. So let's go through them together. How did Mrs. Old change? And why did she change? What do you guys think? I'll give you guys a couple seconds before I respond. Okay. I think she changed. Well, first it started with the influence of her husband. I don't know, it just seemed to me that she almost kind of outdid herself, and that's actually what Frederick says, is that she outdid herself in her harshness, and once that little seed of slavery and what it meant really got in her soul, it started to corrupt her, and she transitioned from thinking of him as a person to an object and part of the house. So what plan did Frederick adopt to learn how to read now that Mrs. Old was no longer teaching him? Do you guys remember that he used to walk around with some bread? Well, he did. He walked around with bread and would, because he had plenty to eat, he would bribe the little boys who were hungry in the neighborhood to teach him to read. In exchange, he would give him the bread that he was carrying around. And he did this without being caught because he would quickly get his chores done and then make up for it with having a reading lesson. That was really smart. Why is it ironic that he bribed the little white boys to teach him to read? I think it was ironic because they wanted food and he wanted the food of knowledge. So he had bread, which he could use to survive as a human. But you can't get anywhere beyond that. It's just surviving. And while they may not have had that, the white boys had the bread of knowledge. They could go to school. They could learn. And that's what he craved, because then you're not just surviving, but with that knowledge, he could actually live and think for himself. Oh, man. What irony does Frederick find in this statement? It is almost an unpardonable offense to teach slaves to read in this Christian country. Well, what do you guys think? So, well, it's sad because, first of all, I think Christianity was supposed to be, based on love, right? And to teach slaves to think would be to have them almost be able to, think for themselves and be considered equal. And it's ironic, I think, because in a religion that's supposed to be based on love, they couldn't offer that same sense of humanity to slaves. What did Frederick learn from the book The Columbian Orator? Do you guys remember? Well, I think based on what I read, he started thinking about the word abolition. And I'll leave a comment down below in case there was something else about the Columbian Orator. Anyway, how does Master Old's prediction about Frederick and learning come true? Well, once he learned how to read and how to write, the idea that he needed to be free and the injustice of what slavery was really started to sink in with him. Because, have you guys ever not known something and then once you figured out what it was, it is impossible to go back to your old way of thinking. Like, say you always had pizza without pepperoni, and then one day you had pizza with pepperoni, and it was just so much better you could never go back to eating pizza without realizing how good pepperoni was on it. That's kind of what Frederick's talking about with abolition. Once he learned what slavery was and its impact, and once he could think for himself, he couldn't just be okay with being a slave in good condition for the rest of his life. He wanted to be free and be able to think for himself, because he proved that he could. And that's exactly what Master Old warned about, was once you could teach a slave to read and think for himself, they could no longer be a slave. How does Frederick learn the meaning of the word abolition and abolitionist? You guys remember? So the slaves talked about it, or excuse me, the slave masters talked about it as something like as a consequence. If something bad happened, it was because of abolition. So if a slave ran away, it was because of abolition. And again, these something bad is in the context of what a slave master might think is bad. So, an abolition was a movement, or abolition was the freeing of slaves. And so, if slaves got in this idea that this movement exists and they wanted it for themselves, they would go someplace to be free. And, alright, and so what did the two Irishmen encourage him to do? Well, they encourage him to run away and go up north to be free. And did you guys catch why he doesn't trust them? Well, first of all, it's sad because historically at this time, the Irish people, while they were free, they were also oppressed. So they came to this country and weren't treated much better than slaves. So you'd think that they would have more sympathy for slaves, but a lot of people, unfortunately, kind of like how we were discussing in the book Liddy, if you found a slave, you could catch him, return him, and get a reward, and it was usually a pretty good reward. And so Frederick was afraid that these people seemed to be nice to him, but if he became friends with them and let his guard down, they would betray him for money. And 2 more questions left. I know it's a lot, but we only got 2 more, so stay with me. How does Frederick learn to write? I actually thought this was pretty clever. He would bet the boys that he could learn a letter or spell better than him. And so every time he bet them, he would write the letters he learned in the shipyard, which was only like 4 or 5 letters out of 26, and be like, oh, well, I can write better than you, and learn the other letters that the boys wrote trying to beat Frederick. So that was very sneaky. And he also, once his master's son started going to school, he would copy his reading books that he had at the house. And I kind of accidentally spoiled 10, because it says, how did he trick the white boys into teaching him new letters? Well, I kind of already covered that, so my bad, guys. But anyway, that is Chapter 7 of the narrative of the life and death of Frederick Douglass. I know it's a lot, but it's important, and I hope you guys learned from this chapter, and I will get ready probably to read Chapter 8 soon. I'm going to go over the questions. So please stay safe, know that we care about you guys, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.